Hi, Professor.
Hi, Frank. Nice to see you again.
A pleasure.
This has been an exciting week, very different from the sorts of things that we usually find ourselves talking about, because it's what's going on in England that is attracting most people's attention, even if they're not actually involved as British citizens or residents. It seems to be having an effect on most parts of the world in one way or another, and so everybody's watching it. But I find it very interesting to watch what's happened politically in the last week, since, and if you compare the process of choosing the next prime minister in England with the process of choosing the next president of the United States.
It's an embarrassment to Americans.
Well, it's great not to have a constitution, or at least not to have one written. So
Yes.
you act according to precedent. We're still not sure what's going to happen to the leadership of the Labour Party, and the political system in England really requires a good leadership of the opposition as well. And that's probably going to take a little while. Although who knows? Maybe some similar way of accelerating that will be found. But I mean, it's interesting that the new Prime Minister in England has a reputation already in Europe as well as in England, even though nobody was expecting her to be Prime Minister now. It always seems to me, and I admit that I could very well be a little chauvinist in this regard, but it seems to me that there's been something about what goes on in England that has been in advance of what goes on socially in other parts of the world for some time. I mean, what happened in England in the 17th century financially was ahead of what was going to happen in most other places. And you can talk about a lot of things that have happened since then in similar ways. But now, I mean, what happened on June 23rd with this referendum was something nobody was expecting. And it was probably the same sort of social development that America is seeing in the presidential primaries here, and France with Marine Le Pen, and even similar things going on in other European countries. But it's worked very differently. And it's still working, and everybody's glued to their screens to see what's going to happen next. It's going to be fascinating now to see just exactly how the people in Brussels, who are really being quite, what shall I say, not welcoming, but very.
They're pulling.
I don't want to say intelligent, since that sounds patronizing, but they're trying to work it out as it happens. So I think the negotiation is going to be extremely interesting, and probably, and this is something I've been saying now ever since June 23rd, I think that it will finish up being all the better both for England and for Europe, because it's going to make the Europeans start thinking about things that they should have thought about before.
Well, I think your observation about the UK being a little bit ahead of the game historically is actually quite right. When you think about maybe the last 300 or 400 years, globalization really was happening at the forefront with the British Empire, with dozens and dozens of countries all feeding in culturally and economically into one fairly small island, with a fairly small subset of population in control. And Britain was far ahead of the rest of the world, I think, in terms of exposure to other cultures and exposure to other peoples, and vice versa. I mean, most of the British colonies willingly went along with the development of British educational systems and things. And now, of course, with the usurpation of that physical requirement because of the internet and various other means, it stands to reason that Britain would once again get there first. So the question of where there is really what the issue is.
Well, it's interesting that migration was one of the main topics that was discussed in the debate. And so in many ways, probably the result of the referendum that has brought England to the fore in this process now is a result of the sort of unevenness we've been talking about before, which Britain has probably been experiencing more than most other places. Because, I mean, one of the problems in England for some time has been that southeast England, and especially London, or southeast England is London and its suburbs, is a very different country from northern England,
Yes.
especially once you get the other side of Manchester to the north.
Mm-hmm.
And that was reflected in the vote. And one of the things that Theresa May has been saying is that she's very concerned to try to make sure that the government's policies take this sort of unevenness into account, which I've never heard anybody say in quite so much detail before.
Well, I don't know how they're actually going to do that. That's going to be the trick here. I mean, with the group that's been appointed, especially the forward-facing group that's actually going to have to negotiate with Brussels and negotiate with other countries. I mean, the French are appalled. I'm sure you've read the same articles that I read once Boris Johnson was named as the foreign minister.
Oh, well, I wonder what Hillary Clinton thought.
Well,
because what he said about her, I forget the actual wording now, but
yeah, it was not complimentary. He's criticized Obama's Kenyan ancestry, and I mean, he's a super loose cannon. And,
yeah.
and now he's going to have to put his money where his mouth is. He's
Yeah.
actually going to have to sit down and negotiate these things out. I'm for somebody who ducked and ran for cover the day after the Brexit vote, I'm surprised he agreed to do this. But I suppose the enticement was too much.
Well, I think that he lost his support, and that's why he ducked after the 23rd.
Mm-hmm.
But somebody has said, and I forget now who said it, that the first thing he's got to do is to work out what the foreign secretary is for, what the foreign office is for, since most of what the foreign office used to do is now being done by other departments.
That's true. I think it's going to be a very interesting time now, and I don't know what's going to happen. I'm personally glad, though, that my retirement funds have skyrocketed since June 24th. But yet again, I mean, any time you look at any economic news, everybody still keeps predicting recession in England and significant job losses in England.
Yeah.
So they're not by any stretch of the imagination out of the woods, but there's no doubt that the effect this is having on the European Union is causing a bit of introspection and just causing them to begin to wonder how exactly are we going to go forward. Because as we've often discussed here, I mean, they're so far from one shore now that they can't easily turn back. They have to keep swimming.
Yeah. The other thing I think that we should talk about this week is the South China Sea.
Yes. Now let me ask you a question. Do you think that the leadership in Beijing was unprepared for this public relations disaster? Or did they know that it was coming and just simply decided that they were not going to pay attention to it and forget about it?
It's very difficult to work out what goes on in the minds of people in Beijing.
Yes. Yes.
It's difficult to believe that they weren't expecting it.
They responded within 2 hours with a whole gigantic white paper, and so they knew. But I think for some reason they didn't grasp the fact that for the first time a quote-unquote independent tribunal was going to rule against them, and they wouldn't have a leg to stand on legally, any fig leaf to hide behind, any of this historical stuff that they bring out claiming their control over this area has all just been vaporized.
But it's difficult to see what anybody is going to be able to do about it.
Nothing. Nothing. The only thing that I think is going to happen is that the stakes are going to be raised if the Chinese intensify their efforts in that area. And the United States has a nuclear-powered battle group aircraft carrier group in that area right now. They have a task force there, and I don't know whether Obama is intent on mixing it up in his last 6 months in office, but I think it's very clear that if the Chinese simply ignore this and continue to accelerate building runways and doing the dredging operations, I think that the line in the sand is going to have been reached.
Well, we're also waiting to see what the other countries that surround the South China Sea, what their reaction is going to be, because it's only the Philippines that actually struck out and did something about it.
Did the Singaporeans and the Malaysians not say anything yet?
Not that I've seen.
Okay.
And nobody's told us just exactly what was considered in the case in The Hague.
Mm-hmm.
And all this should presumably be made public.
One would think, yeah.
Because we need to know what the court in The Hague thinks the case is, and that would give the Chinese something to respond to if they think it's worth responding. Although the way they've dealt with it so far suggests they don't even think it's worth responding.
Well, the other thing I was surprised about was at least from the few articles I read that might or might not be true, is that domestic Chinese public opinion seems very much against the ruling. So I don't know if the Chinese leadership has managed to equate the efforts in the Spratly Islands with great patriotism and trying to exercise Chinese influence in that part of the world, but apparently the public opinion is very much pro continuing what they're doing.
Well, the way I have seen this is that the Middle Kingdom is on the rise.
Yes.
Oh, yes. It's a resurgence of traditional Chinese thinking about the world, which was in retreat for some time, since the 19th century in particular, in face of the force of the colonial operators, especially the British, and has been gradually rising since the revolution, and especially since the 80s.
Well, I think that I agree with that. We've talked about that, but there's always been a certain amount of pragmatism, it seems, in Beijing, insofar as making sure that their efforts are in line with reality, insofar as the military goes and geopolitical influence goes. And they certainly may feel that they have the geopolitical influence to do what they're doing now. But whether or not they take that next step and are ready to match militarily the U.S. Navy and whatever other assets might be used against them is a different matter. And then that leads to the next question. Is the West really ready to go to war over something like this? I don't know.
I'm sure the West would try to manage things in such a way that they wouldn't be firing the first shot.
Well, that I'm sure, that calculation I'm sure is going on in Beijing. How far can they push?
Yeah. And I think a lot depends on who talks to whom.
Mm-hmm.
And over the last 50 years, the tendency in the West has been, if people do things you don't like them to do, then you stop talking to them.
Right, right.
And one of the things I liked about Boris Johnson's first statement, no, not his first statement, about some of the things that were brought up from his record about whether he's a good person to be put in the position of foreign secretary or not, was some of the things he'd said about Iran over the last 10 years were, I thought, much more sensible than what the governments of England and America were saying.
Yeah, I saw that. I mean, he's got a little bit of a globalized view when he wants to discard his buffoon routine. He could be I have a great deal of faith in Theresa May. I don't know justifiably or not, but I don't think she would have appointed him unless she really had viewed him to be credible.
I imagine she has agreements with all of them.
Oh, I'm sure.
It's the very interesting selection of people. So,
Well, we can leave it at that. And
okay.
hopefully the United States can put its own very interesting selection of people forward next January.
Well, we're waiting for the nomination of the vice presidential
Yes.
candidates, right?
Yeah, it's nothing, just the perhaps the Indiana governor they're rumoring now might be running with Trump, but it's nothing confirmed yet. So,
Uh,
all right, Professor Spooner, see you
Okay.
next week. Thank you very much.
Bye.
All right, bye.